The guards don't speak, which Dane figures is either a very good sign or a very bad one. And given that they showed up at 0300 with neural restraints and expressions like carved stone, he's leaning toward bad. He tries asking where they're taking him, politely then less politely, then with the kind of creative profanity that got him written up twice during basic training. But they just march him down the corridor of the orbital station like he's a piece of cargo that happens to have legs. The shuttle ride down to Talvera Prime takes 40 minutes, and Dane spends 38 of them running through every stupid thing he's done in the past 6 months. The bar fight with Counselor Vret's nephew probably tops the list, though in his defense, the kid started it by implying humans evolved from something that rhymes with ditch ape and smells worse. There was also the incident with the ceremonial fountain and the protein rations that weren't technically expired, but definitely weren't fresh. Maybe someone finally noticed he'd been padding his security reports with lorem ipsum text because reading 16 pages about perimeter integrity every week was slowly killing his soul. The palace rises out of the capital like a spike of crystalline fury, wrapped in an energy field that makes his teeth ache even through the shuttle's shielding. They land on a platform that's bigger than his entire apartment block back in Detroit, and the guards haul him through corridors so polished he can see his reflection looking confused and underdressed in tactical pants and a shirt that's definitely not palace appropriate. Tapestries taller than houses line the walls, depicting battles where people with long ears ride things with too many legs into combat against what he hopes are metaphorical demons and not documentary evidence. The doors at the end of the hall are 20 feet tall and probably weigh more than the shuttle. They swing open in perfect silence, which is somehow more intimidating than if they'd crashed open like in the movies. The chamber beyond is circular, ringed with faces he recognizes from newscasts. General Kairos with her crimson armor and reputation for never retreating. Minister Thalen, whose trade negotiations are legendary for leaving the other side somehow grateful they got fleeced. At least a dozen others whose names he should probably know but doesn't, because he skipped that part of the cultural briefing to watch the playoffs. At the center of the room stands a woman who makes every instinct Dane has scream that he should be somewhere else. Anywhere else. Preferably a different star system. Queen Theris is 7 feet of blue-skin muscle and controlled violence, golden hair spilling over armor that gleams like it's been polished with the hopes and dreams of people who crossed her. Her eyes are violet, fixed on him with an intensity that makes his mouth go dry, and she's holding a blade that's definitely not ceremonial, because he can see where someone's recently sharpened the edge. To her right stands a young woman, pale as moonlight, black hair cascading to her waist. Her ears rise to elegant points, and her hand rests on her stomach in a gesture that seems unconscious, protective. She's watching him with an expression he can't read, something between fear and defiance, and maybe recognition, though that's probably wishful thinking, because he's never seen her before in his life. The guards shove him forward and he goes down on his knees on marble, so cold it burns through his pants. Someone behind him announces his name and identification number, like he's a case file instead of a person. Queen Theris doesn't speak. She just stares, circling him slowly, blade still in hand, and Dane becomes intensely aware that he hasn't had coffee yet, and his last shower was 16 hours ago, and he probably smells like the recycled air and instant noodles that constitute his entire diet. The silence stretches. Someone coughs. Dane considers making a joke about how, if they wanted him for breakfast, they could have just sent an invitation. But his survival instinct finally wakes up enough to strangle that impulse before it reaches his mouth. The pale woman shifts her weight, and the queen's eyes flick toward her, with something that might be rage or grief or both. Then back to Dane with renewed focus. He's definitely getting executed. The only question is whether he'll get to find out why first, or if they're going to keep it a surprise right up until the blade comes down. Either way, he thinks with the kind of clarity that comes from absolute terror, he really should have had that coffee. The queen stops circling, and the temperature in the room seems to drop 10 degrees, which Dane knows is impossible because the environmental controls in Talveran architecture are supposedly flawless. But his body doesn't care about architectural specifications when there's a 7-foot monarch staring at him like he's a particularly offensive stain on her nice marble floor. She opens her mouth, closes it, then turns to the pale woman with an expression that could curdle milk at 50 paces. The memory hits him sideways, uninvited, dragging him back 6 months to Casemir station, and the smell of recycled air mixed with something the Talvarans burned in their quarters that was supposed to be incense, but smelled more like electrical fire and regret. The treaty negotiations had been dragging into their third week, which meant everyone was exhausted and paranoid, and the human delegation had started a betting pool on which species would throw the first punch. Dane's job was glorified babysitting, make sure nobody planted listening devices in the bathrooms, ensure the Corellian ambassador didn't spike anyone's drink with that thing they called whiskey, but was probably industrial solvent, prevent intergalactic incidents in hallways. He'd been off duty, standing in the observation lounge because watching the asteroid field was better than watching another delegate argue about mineral rights using interpretive hand gestures. She'd appeared next to him without warning, which should have triggered every bit of his security training, but instead just made him notice she had the kind of smile that suggested she knew exactly how absurd the whole diplomatic circus was and found it privately hilarious. If I have to hear one more speech about historical mining precedents, I'm going to throw myself out an airlock, she'd said, and Dane had laughed before he could stop himself because that was basically treason when you were supposed to be protecting the people giving those speeches. I'd offered to help, but my contract specifically forbids assisting in the suicide of diplomatic personnel, he'd replied, and she'd laughed too. The kind of genuine sound you didn't hear much in spaces where everyone was performing for everyone else. Her name was Arin, she told him. Minor trade liaison, stuck on the delegation because someone needed to make sure the refreshments didn't violate anyone's dietary restrictions, which was apparently a full-time job when you had 3 species with incompatible biochemistry trying to share a space station. She didn't have an entourage, didn't have guards hovering 3 feet away, didn't have that look people got when they were constantly calculating who was watching and what they should say to whom. Just a woman tired of pageantry, watching rocks tumble through the void. They'd talked until the station's dawn cycle, which was arbitrary but still felt significant when the lights shifted from night mode blue to something approximating natural sunlight. She knew things about Earth that surprised him, not the textbook stuff about continents and governments, but small details like how rain smelled different depending on what region you were in, how certain cities had specific sounds that became part of your internal soundtrack. He'd asked how she knew that, and she'd smiled and said she'd done her research. Like to understand the places treaties touched, even if the negotiators didn't care about anything beyond tonnage and tariffs. The second night she'd found him in the same spot, and he'd started to suspect it wasn't coincidence. They'd talked about things that had nothing to do with mining rights or trade agreements, music that didn't translate well between species, the weird loneliness of space stations where everyone was temporary, the feeling of watching stars and knowing you'd never visit most of them. The third night she'd kissed him first and he'd kissed her back, and they'd ended up in his quarters because hers were apparently undergoing maintenance, which should have been suspicious, but he'd been too busy being 28 and stupid to question good fortune. 3 nights. That was all it had been. She'd left with her delegation when the treaty was signed, kissed him goodbye with something that felt like genuine regret, and vanished into the crowd of departing ships. He'd thought about her for weeks, running through conversations in his head, wondering if he should have asked for contact information or if that would have been presumptuous. Eventually, he'd filed her away in the mental drawer labeled Good Memories That Don't Get Sequels and gone back to his rotation on the orbital station, protecting people who mostly didn't need protecting from threats that mostly didn't exist. Now she's standing 15 feet away, hand on her stomach, silver eyes meeting his with an expression that's part apology and part defiance. And Dane's brain is trying to process why a minor trade liaison is in the throne room wearing clothes that probably cost more than his annual salary. The Queen is still staring at him, blade still in hand, and someone in the assembled council clears their throat with the kind of deliberate emphasis that suggests things are about to get significantly worse. Queen Theris moves so fast that Dane's brain doesn't register the motion until the blade is an inch from his throat, close enough that he can feel the cold radiating off the metal, which he's pretty sure is some kind of exotic alloy that probably has a name he can't pronounce, and properties that would make a materials engineer weep with joy. His brain helpfully supplies that this is a terrible time to be thinking about metallurgy, but apparently that's how he's choosing to handle imminent death. Did you know my daughter is pregnant, human? The queen's voice is low, venomous, each word dropping into the silence like stones into still water. And Dane's world tilts sideways so hard he thinks he might actually fall over, despite already being on his knees. Daughter. The word ricochets around his skull, bouncing off every synapse that's desperately trying to make the math work. Aaron, trade liaison Aaron, observation lounge Aaron, 3 nights on Casemir station Aaron, is the queen's daughter, which makes her a princess, which makes the woman currently holding a blade to his throat very interested in his immediate past in ways that are extremely bad for his continued existence. His mouth opens, but nothing comes out except a sound that's probably supposed to be a word, but lands somewhere closer to a dying transmission from a malfunctioning radio. The queen pulls the blade back just enough to start pacing, switching to rapid Talvern that makes the translator butt in his ear work overtime, spitting out fragments about bloodlines and ancient law, and something that his translator renders as genetic contamination, but might also mean abomination, depending on context. A minister steps forward, older guy with a scar running from his temple to his jaw that suggests he's survived things that killed other people. His voice drips with contempt that doesn't need translation. Immediate execution. The human violated the Princess Royal. The law is clear on this matter. He says it like Dane's already dead, like they're just working out the paperwork, and several heads around the circle nod in agreement. But another voice cuts through. A woman in crimson armor that's seen actual combat based on the scoring along the shoulder plates. General Kairos, his brain supplies, the one who held the Outer Rim for 3 years against impossible odds, and apparently has opinions about royal law. She's quoting something in Old Talvaran, the formal dialect that sounds like singing if singing could cut you, and the translator is struggling to keep up, but keeps spitting out phrases like bloodright and sovereign bond and protection of the heir. Dane's still trying to process the word pregnant, because that shouldn't be possible. Like genuinely scientifically shouldn't be possible. Humans and Talvarans have incompatible genetic structures, and he definitely learned that in the orientation briefing he mostly slept through. Cross-species relationships happen, sure, but they're sterile by default, everyone knows that. It's basic xenobiology. Except apparently not, because Erin's hand is still resting on her stomach, and the way the queen is vibrating with barely controlled rage suggests this isn't a hypothetical situation. He didn't know who I was. Erin's voice cuts through the argument, clear and sharp, and every head in the room swivels toward her. She doesn't flinch, doesn't lower her eyes, just stares at her mother with the kind of defiance that probably takes years of practice when you're facing down someone who could kill you without breaking a sweat. I didn't tell him. The law doesn't account for knowledge or intent, only blood and consequence. The queen looks like she wants to argue, wants to find some loophole that makes this someone else's problem, but she doesn't speak. The scarred minister starts to say something, but General Kiros talks over him, still quoting legal code that sounds like it was carved into stone tablets back when humans were still figuring out fire. The gist, as far as Dane's panicking brain can follow, is that cross-species conception is nearly impossible. But when it happens, ancient law kicks in. Something about the child carrying royal blood, about legitimacy, about the father being bound to the throne to protect the heir from exactly the kind of political nightmare that's currently unfolding. One of the younger counselors, a man whose ceremonial robes can't hide the military bearing underneath, steps forward and drops to one knee. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire assembled council is kneeling, and Dane has no idea what's happening until they speak in perfect unison, their voices shaking the walls and probably violating several noise ordinance laws that definitely don't apply to throne rooms. King! The word hangs in the air like a grenade that hasn't decided whether to explode yet. Dane's pretty sure he laughs, though it comes out wrong. Too high and sharp, because this is insane. This is beyond insane. This is the kind of thing that happens in bad historical dramas that get canceled after one season. Him. King. He's a contractor from Detroit who once got stuck in a ventilation shaft for 6 hours because he misread a schematic. His last performance review included the phrase, "needs improvement in formal protocol," which was generous considering he'd called an ambassador dude 3 times in one meeting. The Queen's blade is shaking in her hand, and her eyes promise murder. But she hasn't moved, hasn't given the order. And Dane realizes with creeping horror that maybe, possibly, the council isn't joking. The laughter dies in Dane's throat when he realizes nobody else is laughing, which is generally a sign that the joke is either terrible or not actually a joke. And given that an entire war council is currently kneeling and calling him a title that should require significantly more qualification than 3 nights with someone who failed to mention she was royalty, he's leaning toward the latter. He tries to stand, but his legs have apparently decided they're on strike, so he settles for looking up at Queen Theris with what he hopes is an expression that conveys, surely there's been some kind of mistake, but probably just looks like panic with a side of nausea. This is fixable, he says, and his voice cracks on the last syllable, like he's 15 again. There's paperwork, right? Forms? I'm great with forms. Love forms. There's got to be something that says you need, I don't know, actual qualifications to be king. A resume. References. I got written up twice last year for unauthorized modification of security protocols, which was really more of a creative interpretation than a violation, but still probably not king material. The scarred minister rises from his knee with a look that suggests he's considering adding another scar to his collection, using Dane's face as the canvas. The law of succession is absolute. When the heir is conceived, both parents assume co-sovereignty to ensure the child's legitimacy and protection. There is no paperwork, no ceremony, no choice. He spits the last word like it personally offends him. The bloodright is invoked at conception. You became king the moment the child took root, human, whether you deserve it or not. Spoiler alert, I definitely don't deserve it, Dane mutters, but nobody seems interested in his self-assessment. General Kiros is back on her feet, talking rapidly with 2 other counselors about something involving legal precedent and cross-species complications, while shooting looks at Aaron that range from curious to calculating. The younger counselor who started the whole kneeling situation is watching Dane like he's a fascinating specimen that might do something interesting if poked with a stick. Queen Theris finally lowers her blade, but the rage in her eyes hasn't diminished, just compressed into something denser and more dangerous, like a star collapsing into a black hole that's really unhappy about the whole process. I had plans, she says, and her voice is quiet now, which is somehow worse than the shouting. Aaron was to marry Commander Velik of the Northern Fleet. Strong bloodline, military connections, political leverage with the outer systems. Useful. She looks at Dane the way someone might look at a bug that's crawled into their expensive wine. You are none of those things. I mean, I'm pretty good at chess, Dane offers, because apparently his brain has decided that if he's going to die, he might as well die saying stupid things. And I once talked a Corellian smuggler out of starting a firefight in a crowded casino, which required significant diplomatic skills that I'm happy to put on my king resume if that's still a thing we're doing. One of the counselors actually snorts, then tries to cover it with a cough when the queen glares in their direction. Aaron's lips twitch in what might be the ghost of a smile, but it vanishes so quickly, Dane thinks he might have imagined it. The scarred minister looks like he's mentally composing Dane's obituary and enjoying the process entirely too much. The law may be absolute, the minister says, turning to address the council rather than Dane, but laws were written when such abominations were theoretical. The child is half human, genetically contaminated. The bloodline has been pure for 600 years, and now he gestures at Dane like he's evidence in a particularly distasteful trial. This dilutes everything we preserved. There are solutions, medical interventions. The pregnancy is early enough that... No! Aaron's voice cuts through the room like a blade of her own, and suddenly everyone remembers she's there, hands still resting on her stomach in a gesture that's gone from unconscious to deliberate. The law protects the heir, both heirs, all of them, throughout history, regardless of circumstance. Or does the council now decide which laws are absolute and which are merely suggestions? The silence that follows is the kind that precedes either breakthroughs or bloodshed, and Dane can't tell which way it's going to tip. Several counselors are nodding, whether in agreement or just acknowledgement, he can't tell. Others look like they're doing complex political calculus in their heads, weighing options and outcomes, and whose throat to slit when nobody's looking. The queen is staring at her daughter with an expression that might be pride or fury or both. And Dane realizes, with a cold wash of clarity, that he's not the only one in danger here. They're looking at Aaron's stomach like it's a problem, and people with power tend to solve problems permanently. The guards escort them to what they call a guest suite, but what Dane recognizes as a very pretty prison, complete with doors that seal with the kind of hiss that says, "These are magnetically locked, and you're not getting out without authorization." The furniture looks like it costs more than his entire bloodline has earned in 3 generations, all flowing curves, and what might be actual precious metals inlaid in wood that probably came from a tree that only grows on mountains blessed by ancient spirits, or something equally ridiculous. There's fruit on a table that he's pretty sure is luminescent, which seems unnecessary but does explain why the bowl doesn't need a light source. The moment the door seals, Dane rounds on Aaron with 6 months of confusion compressed into a single question that comes out as several questions colliding midair. Why didn't you tell me who you were? How is this even biologically possible? What am I supposed to do with a crown? Do I get a crown? Is there a hat? Please tell me there's not a hat because I look terrible in hats, and that's going to be a whole thing if there are state functions. There's no hat, Aaron says, and she actually smiles. Small and tired, but genuine. The coronation circlet is more of a neural interface that links to the palace systems. It reads biometrics and intent, prevents assassination by poison or neural tampering, and makes sure you can't accidentally declare war by sneezing during a council session. Oh, good, it's a brain-reading hat. That's so much better than a regular hat. Dane drops into a chair that immediately adjusts to his body in ways that feel invasive and uncomfortably accurate. So when you said you were a minor trade liaison, I was handling refreshments. That part was technically true. She moves to the window which overlooks the Capitol spread out below, like a circuit board made of lights and architecture. I just didn't mention that I was also the heir to the throne, daughter of Queen Theris, and generally not allowed to breathe without 6 guards and a security detail that logs every conversation. Casemir Station was the first time I'd been anywhere without handlers in 5 years. My mother thought having me manage diplomatic catering would be safely boring. Her hand drifts to her stomach again. She was wrong. Dane watches her reflection in the window, trying to reconcile Observation Lounge Aaron with Princess Aaron, and finding they're the same person just wearing different contexts like clothes. The whole cross-species conception thing, that's really not supposed to work? Genetic compatibility between humans and Talverns is 0.003%. Conception requires not just compatible DNA, but synchronized biochemistry, matching reproductive cycles, and about 6 other factors that almost never align. She turns from the window, meeting his eyes directly. The science says it's functionally impossible, but there are old stories, legends about bloodline magic and fate choosing parents for children that need to exist. I thought they were metaphors until 3 months ago, when I couldn't keep food down and the medical scans showed something growing that definitely shouldn't be. So what you're saying is, we beat odds that were essentially zero, created a political nightmare that might get us both killed, and I'm now king of a planet I couldn't find on a map 6 months ago. Dane runs his hands through his hair, which doesn't help anything but gives him something to do with the nervous energy. I could run. There's always a way out if you're desperate enough. Bribe a cargo pilot, fake an ID, disappear into the outer colonies where nobody asks questions if you've got credits. The silence that follows his words is heavy enough to have its own gravitational pull. Aaron doesn't move, doesn't speak, just watches him with those silver eyes that seem to see more than he wants to show. Finally, she crosses to the chair opposite his, settling into it with the careful grace of someone who's constantly aware of the thing growing inside her. If you run, I won't stop you. I can't stop you. The law makes you king, but it doesn't make you stay. Her voice is level, factual, like she's discussing weather patterns rather than his potential abandonment. The council will call it abdication. There'll be a scandal that lasts a decade, My mother will find some way to salvage the succession, probably by marrying me off to whoever can stomach a wife pregnant with a half-human child. And our kid, she pauses, the possessive pronoun hanging in the air between them. Our kid will grow up knowing their father was given a crown and chose to run rather than deal with the mess, which honestly might be better than staying and resenting us both for the trap. That's a pretty bleak sales pitch, Dane says. I'm not selling. I'm being honest. Aaron leans back, and for the first time since the throne room, she looks exhausted, the kind of tired that goes bone deep. I chose you on Casemir Station. 3 nights where I got to be just Aaron, and you were just Dane, and nothing else mattered. I don't regret that. But I didn't choose this. She gestures at the room, the palace beyond, the entire impossible situation. Neither of us did, so I'm asking, if you stay, is it because you actually want to be here? Or am I just useful? The question sits between them like a live grenade, and Dane realizes he's been asked variations of it his entire life. Are you here because you want to be, or because you don't know how to leave? And he's never had a good answer, which is probably why he ended up as a contractor bouncing between stations instead of doing something that required commitment beyond 6-month rotations. He looks at Aaron, really looks at her, seeing both versions at once. The woman who laughed at his terrible jokes in the observation lounge, and the princess who just told an entire war council to shove their political calculations, and discovers they're not actually different people, just the same person who's been dealing with impossible situations longer than he has. I don't love you, he says, because if they're being honest, they might as well be completely honest. I don't know you well enough yet. 3 nights is just 3 nights, no matter how good they were, and I'm definitely not qualified to be king of anything, let alone a planet with a 600-year-old bloodline and apparently strong feelings about genetic purity. Aaron nods like she expected this, maybe even hoped for it, the truth instead of pretty lies. Noted. Anything else? Yeah. I'm also not the kind of person who walks away from a kid who didn't ask to be born into a political nightmare. Dane stands up, paces to the window, watches the Capitol glitter below like a promise or a threat depending on your perspective. My dad left when I was 6. Just decided one day that being a father was too hard, too complicated, too much commitment for someone who wanted to keep his options open. I spent 20 years telling myself I understood, that he had his reasons, that sometimes the brave thing is knowing when to walk away. He turns back to face her. Turns out I was lying to myself because I'm still angry about it, and I'm not doing that to another kid. Our kid, even if the math says they shouldn't exist. Something shifts in Aaron's expression. Not relief exactly, but recognition. Like he's finally said something that makes sense in the chaos. That's not exactly a romantic declaration. You want romance? We can work on that later. Right now, I'm offering a functional partnership between 2 people who got blindsided by biology and politics. He moves back to his chair, sits forward with his elbows on his knees. You need someone who won't fold when the knives come out. I need someone who knows how this place works and can keep me from accidentally declaring war by using the wrong fork at dinner. The kid needs parents who show up even when it's hard. That's something we can build if you're willing. Erin extends her hand across the space between them. Not romantic, not ceremonial, just practical. A contract between 2 people trapped in the same impossible situation who've decided to face it together. Dane takes it, her fingers cool against his palm, and feels something settle in his chest that might be resolve, or might be terror, but is definitely commitment. The door opens without warning, and Queen Theris stands there with her blade sheathed and her expression carved from ice. Behind her the council waits, a wall of faces that range from hostile to calculating to cautiously hopeful. She looks at their joined hands, at Aaron's defiant posture, at Dane's face, which he hopes conveys, I'm taking this seriously and not, I'm about to throw up from stress. The council has questions, concerns. Several members have suggested alternatives that would resolve the succession without requiring a human king. Her voice is flat, diplomatic, the kind of tone that hides daggers. I told them we would hear your answer first. Will you run or will you stand? Dane thinks about Detroit, about the apartment he'll never see again, and the life that was comfortable because it never asked much of him. He thinks about his father's absence and the hole it left, about 3 nights on a station where he got to be happy without complications, about a kid who's going to grow up with pointed ears and questions about why they don't look like everyone else. He thinks about Erin's hand in his and the way she faced down an entire council without flinching. He stands up, joints cracking because he's been kneeling and sitting for what feels like hours, and meets the Queen's violet eyes without looking away. I'll stand. I'm going to be terrible at this, and I'll probably insult half the council by accident in the first week, and there's a decent chance I'll need extensive coaching on literally everything from protocol to politics. But I'm staying. For Erin, for the kid, and because apparently the universe has a sense of humor and decided a contractor from Detroit should learn what a crown weighs. General Kuros actually grins behind the Queen's shoulder. The scarred minister looks like he's swallowed something sour. Erin squeezes his hand once, quick and firm, then releases it to stand beside him, presenting a unified front that's probably going to need a lot of work, but is at least a start. Queen Thera studies them both for a long moment, and something in her expression shifts. Not acceptance, not approval, but acknowledgement that the situation is what it is, and fighting it won't change the bloodright or the child, or the fact that her daughter chose this particular disaster. She steps aside, gesturing to the corridor beyond. Then come, your counsel awaits, King Dane Cortez. Try not to embarrass us all immediately.